Welcome to another episode of the Institute for Complex Individuation podcast. I am Dr. Lahab Al Samurai, and with me today is Dr. Eric Tomlinson, and we are back on Jung's Map of the Soul by Dr. Maurice Stein. We'd like to say hello to Dr. Maurice Stein. This is amazing work, Marie.
Surely is.
We have turned to chapter 7. And Dr. Stein did us a huge favor by cramming in 3 volumes on the self in about 20 pages. Nice job. So we will discuss the 3 volumes on the self as written by Dr. Stein in his summary. And we will start with that. I'm going to start with what is the self? And that's the first thing we need to kind of get out of the way. It's a stumbling block because people believe the self as the ego. And many different psychologies use the term self, but not in the way Jung used the term self. They use the term self to basically describe the ego function, the ego consciousness, the ego development, a mature ego. But that's not what Jung believed the self to be. Jung stated that the self is the architect of the psyche. For Jung, the self is transcendent. This is on page 152, which means that it is not defined by or contained within the psychic realm, but rather lies beyond it and in an important sense defines it. So if the psychic realm is our psychological energy field that gives us awareness of the world outside, from the inorganic to the organic. So we have this field around us called psychic energy. And this psychic energy is where our functioning is, the non-organic parts of our functioning, the parts of us that are described in particle physics. So Jung says, so this is why I explained that, because what's going to happen is we're going to use the term self and transcendent, and I'm going to lose you. So think of self as not ego, has nothing to do with ego. Think of self as what Jung said is the architect of the psyche. Okay? For Jung, the self is transcendent. Okay, so it transcends time, which means that it's not defined by or contained within the psychic realm, but rather lies beyond it. So it defines the psychic realm does not define it. In an important sense, it defines it. It is the point about the self's transcendence that makes Jung's theory different from those of other self theorists like Kohut. For Jung, the self is paradoxical, not one self. It is more than one subjectivity. Its essence lies beyond the subjective realm. The self forms the ground of the subjective commonality with the world. With the structure of being in the self, subject and object, ego and other are joined in a common field of structure and energy. This is the point I will become most salient from what follows in this chapter. So Stein is going to make this point over and over again. But this is what we start with. This is our beginning. And you see that this chapter is going to be treacherous because it's going to look like it's going to be easy, but then they're going to start talking about nuclear fission. So
one of the deepest in the book, Dr. Lahab.
Go ahead, Eric. Dr. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you. One thing that really hit me is when he said, in common use, you've already stated this, in common use, self is viewed as the ego. And then he said in Jungian use, self is ego free.
Correct.
And it made me think of, and this chapter talks about, and the next chapter as well, talks about a number of techniques that people try to use to reach this state, to reach individuation, to reach the awakening of their kundalini, whatever way you want to frame it. And the other methods that I've tried to do the same, I never could encapsulate that idea that this is the opposite of ego. This is ego free. This is something that is way beyond the ego. It's not just a learning how to control your ego and therefore rising to a greater level of consciousness. This is something entirely different. And that really helped me. So I wanted to make that point if I could.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of self, so Stein will make the point later on in the chapter that the self would be like the sun, and all the different archetypes would orbit around the sun. So the planets, from Earth to Mars to all of these planets that are interconnected, orbit around this huge sun, the Earth's sun, for example. Or it could be a super sun. Doesn't matter. So there's a gravitational pull that keeps the other archetypal patterns in place.
Oh, very good.
So the anima and the animus, which we talked about in last week, and I theorized that the anima and the animus are one archetype. They're different poles of the archetype. It's I think Jung is quite sophisticated. I think he couldn't express it at the time. It would have been too controversial. So I think he left it open. But he planted all the seeds. The other...
Dr. Lahab?
Yes.
Before you leave that point, can I point out something that you said to me after our podcast last week? And it was kind of like lights went off in my head that you said, and I thought it was a really brilliant way of putting it. You stated that the anima and the animus they lived in a space in between the collective unconscious and our unconscious.
Correct.
And I thought that it cleared up a lot for me when you made that statement. And I wanted to let our listeners, if there are any from last week, to hear that last little gem, because it was an excellent thing to think about. Well, I'm sure we have listeners from last week, but if I hope so. If we are going to talk about that, so what we're talking about is the collective unconscious would be like the external space outside the Earth's orbit. And the personal unconscious would be our atmosphere, or our unconscious would be the atmosphere of the planet. So the archetypes would live in between those, close to the sun, close to that pole, but also independent internally of the self. The self is the architect. It is, so I was thinking today, Eric, I was thinking about the Matrix, and I was thinking about the architect. And so the self can be seen as he represents, the architect represents the father complex. And the other character represents the mother complex for Neo. And Neo is the self, but doesn't realize it. That's why they say he is the one. So if we're thinking metaphorically, that's how we would think of. He doesn't realize that he is not he's a self. She is not she's a self.
he does not come to that conclusion until the end, until all is lost, until he feels that he's about to be defeated, and then he wakes up to the idea that I am more than what I think I am.
I had a question for you, Dr. Lahab. I was reading this, and it relates exactly to what you just described, which is what provoked the question. Because you said Neo didn't know what he was initially. He didn't know what he was. And yet Murray stated that the self is the most impersonal of all the archetypes.
Correct.
And I wasn't 100% sure what he meant by that, but
the most impersonal means the farthest away. So if there's an archetypal order, the ego consciousness is furthest away from the self.
So that's why Neo had trouble relating it to himself.
Correct, because the first thing that needed to go was the ego. So when they disconnected him from the machine, right? He realized his body was weak, that he didn't really have a body. The first thing that had to go was ego. That fight with the idea of the organic, the ego needed to go. So then when he goes into the construct, Morpheus is teaching him that he needs to let go of his ego. He was still using the concept of ego within the construct. Okay. He said the difference between us and the, what do they call them? The sentinels. What do they call the, yeah, I think they're sentinels. The difference was the agents, whatever they were. The difference was that they were born in the system. They are part of the self. They're archetypal.
I think Murray, if I can add,
I don't think Murray talked about the Matrix. Let's not confuse people. No. We're talking about the Matrix.
let me finish, and you'll see that it's not about the Matrix. I think it was in this book by Murray that it stated. It might have been in Whitmont's book, but anyway, he stated that when Yahweh was at the burning bush with Moses,
yes,
Moses said, "What is your name?" And he said, God said, "I am that I am." Ooh. And most people, and myself included, for years have gone, "What the heck does that mean?" Yeah. And I finally heard a Jungian explanation of it, and it was this: God knows himself.
Yes, he's an archetype. He's an archetypal energy. I am what I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know there is no ego in between.
I thought that was fascinating. I'd never heard that statement.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. We will get back to that one, because I want to get back to that one. I think it's really seminal and part of the work that we are going to talk about in terms of the self. But to get back to the Matrix, and the funny thing is just the Matrix like popped into my head. It just popped into my head as I'm reading. I'm like, this is the Matrix, right? It's like the Wachowski sisters read this and they basically wrote the Matrix. They wrote it from a psychological perspective that's very Jungian.
It is.
Yes. So you have, you have the magician, you have the archetypes there. You know, you have the betrayer, you have all the archetypes. You have the archetypal children, you have the priests, you have the generals, you have the warriors, you have the father and mother, you have all the pieces, and then you have the evolution, if you think of the Matrix as one system, right? Because they refer to it over and over again as one system. One system means one. There's only one. Right? And so the one is liberator and destroyer at the same time of the system. The system strives towards self, At the same time, it's at war with self.
Mm.
Because basically what happens is the archetypal energies have to give power to the self. They have to abdicate power, which they don't like to do. Like within the archetypal structure, the archetypes are independent. But within the psyche itself, the archetypes are ruled by rules. And they have to play by the rules. Even when they're breaking the rules, they're breaking them through the interpretation of the rule. They can't haphazardly say, this is not how it works. They could say, you let me in. You should have left the door open. So when the shadow takes over and makes you do something really stupid, you say, how the hell did that? The shadow goes, you shouldn't have let me in. You left the door open. I told you not to have that sixth drink. So what happens is that they have to abide by the rules. These rules would be the rules of the universe. There are universal rules. And there is always, even in the psyche, there's always a predecessor to the rule that breaks the rule. Something that comes before that breaks that rule that was. So you have an architect, you have a structure. And Stein is going to talk about the structure. So I want to.
Can I ask you a philosophical question about what you said?
Yes.
If a predecessor to the rule breaks the rule, doesn't that mean, just from a philosophical point of view, if nothing else, doesn't that mean that we haven't gone back far enough to see what the rule, the etiology or the origin of the rule?
Only the archetype could break that rule.
Oh.
It does not have an unlimited time. It can't use that rule to break that rule in unlimited times. Unless there's chaos and the self is overwhelmed by the archetypes, which means severe mental illness, like schizophrenia. When the self is trying to fight for its integrity and it's being pulled in different directions because it's basically, the sun has broken up. Its gravitational pull has broken up.
It's deep stuff.
But it's the same thing in the cosmos, Eric.
Once
the planet breaks up, it changes the gravitational pull. It loses parts of the pull. It moves in different direction. It changes everything around it.
That's why I like this phrase that he used. It spins right into this phrase where he said that the self is a deep, largely unconscious pattern of psychological unity and wholeness. And that unity and wholeness,
keep reading, Eric.
Oh, I don't have the book in front of me, sir.
Oh, okay. You just have the quote. Okay, read the quote again.
The self is a deep, largely unconscious pattern of psychological unity and wholeness.
Yes.
And what I got out of that, this phrase is deep, because he's not just talking about He's including individuation. He's not just talking about that. He's talking about a unity and wholeness that is in the micro world in ourselves and in the macro world in the universe. This wholeness and unity of this wholeness is everywhere.
Correct. It is both a reflection of the internal and the external.
Yeah, we're just trying to become a part of that energy.
We're stretching our, that's correct. What we're stretching our imaginations to grasp is that we are a microscopic entity in this universe. But without us, the universe is incomplete. We all are interchanged through the patterns of the universe because the universe writes the code.
Yeah, if there are organisms that can understand it and reflect it and then become, but through choice, to become a part of it.
But that's transcendence, what you're talking about. Not individuation at that point.
Right, and that's the full circle.
Yeah, so it goes beyond individuation. You're talking about transcendence.
Right.
Where you transcend the organic form into that means you hold on to the conscious awareness of that you were once an organic form.
I'm sorry, that's the next chapter. I jumped ahead.
Yeah, so, but what I think is that the organic form is so insignificant in the end for our existence that it's only a stitch in time. And it's a very, very tiny, tiny stitch. It's very hard to see. It's microscopic. It's just a stitch. But it's a stitch part of a very long road. So each experience within the universe cannot stay conscious, right? It can't. What it needs is it needs something to reflect it.
Yes. Okay. Now I got you. It
cannot stay conscious because nothing reflects it. Something has to reflect it. Something has to mirror it. Something has to draw pictures of it. Then it could look in the mirror, just like a little kid who comes in front of the mirror. He does not exist until before then he lived in the unconscious.
And he only sees himself as an extension of something else.
Of something greater, larger. That's why it's so traumatic for the baby to be hurt by the mother or the father or a sibling, because it is unconscious. Those traumas are forcing consciousness towards something that is not ready. Here, I'll throw something your way I think you'll like. Star Trek.
Oh, love it.
Okay, this is the prime directive. The prime directive is don't fuck their consciousness up. They need to evolve.
That's right.
Right?
Right.
That's what happens to young kids when they're traumatized. We're breaking the prime directive. The prime directive says they're not ready.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah, the prime directive is there to protect you from others. Just because your consciousness can be that, I know of limited things, I don't have any enemies. Oh, you do, Eric, you do. You have so many, let me tell you about them. That's fucked up. You messed up. The self sits, the self as an entity is an echo of the whole. But it's such a strong echo that it demands attention. And if you're not paying attention, you project it onto something greater. And that's not false. It is both great and small.
Yeah. And I may add that Stein didn't write about Star Trek in his book.
Yes, well, we want to make that clear because some people are going to say, "Hey, you guys talked about the Matrix and you talked about Star Trek, and that's not in the book." Because we'll get those, and I was like, "Okay, we didn't specify." So I just wanted to make sure. But
no, I'm just following your lead on that. That's all.
He says, we have a lot of young listeners. I don't want to mess with them. They said just a little bit. So Stein says Jung's definition of the self. It's on page 157. On the bottom, he says the self. This is a quote from Jung, from Eon. The self is completely outside the personal sphere and appears, if at all, only as a religious mythologism. And its symbols range from the highest to the lowest. Anyone who wants to achieve the difficult feat of realizing something, not only intellectually, but also according to its feeling value, must, for better or worse, come to grips with the anima and the animus problem. In order to open the way for a high union, a connectio oppositerium, this is indispensable prerequisite for wholeness. At this point in the text, Jung introduces wholeness, a term that is equivalent to the self. Wholeness results, practically speaking, when the self is realized in consciousness. In fact, this is not completely achievable since the polarities and opposite resonance of the self are forever generating more and more new material to integrate. Nevertheless, practicing wholeness on a regular basis is the way to the self, Jung's version of the living Tao. Although wholeness seems at first sight to be nothing but an abstract idea like the anima and the animus, it is nevertheless empirical insofar as it is anticipated by the psyche in the form of spontaneous or autonomous symbols. Okay, I'm going to stop here and say something about this. The realization of wholeness and consciousness of the self is its own energy wave. No matter how much more material there is to integrate, once the wave has taken enough momentum, it could wipe out a continent. The self is a self-generating wave of energy. Remember, all archetypal structures are energy.
Mm-hmm.
What we are integrating is that these energies are not conflictual. They're not fighting each other. They're not questioning each other. They're actually in rhythm with each other. They complement each other. They compensate each other. But they're not pushing and pulling against each other. And this is where Jungian advanced motor processing intertwines in Jungian theory. Because the treatment of the traumas are actually integrating and helping the process of individuation. We are pushing along the process of wholeness.
That really is true that JAMP does that. I know my own sessions, just in my own reflection of my own sessions, it takes this, if I can, anthropomorphize it a little bit, it takes The jam sessions take all the little disparate parts of understanding that I have about a variety of subjects, and it puts them in the same, it takes those pieces and it puts them in one puzzle. It forms one picture. It completes, it makes things whole that prior to that, those sessions, I thought were separate and distinct realities, and they're not.
It shows you the pattern.
Yes.
And that pattern is what reflects wholeness. It is the pattern of the integrated opposites that help us see ourselves as more than just this minuscule thing that exists on the planet. It is those integrated parts that make us feel free. And when we say free, we're not talking about, I'm sorry, Eric, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying when we say free, we're not talking about the idea of free as nobody can hold me to anything. Free meaning that you're liberated from the internal strife, the wars that are going on inside your heads. So always remember.
Which is a war of divide and conquer.
Exactly. Always remember that whatever is going on internally is going on externally. If we're fighting ourselves, we are fighting other nations. If we are having problems with ourselves and the way we feel about ourselves, we're fighting our neighbors. This is always the case. The more integration that occurs within the psyche, the more the individuation process, which is the healing process, which is the ultimate healing. Because if I'm not worried about how I appear, whether feminine or masculine or loving or tender, if I am okay within self, then I could come out whatever I am. I am liberated. I am free. I am free of the contradiction. I am free of the fear. I am free of the anger. I am free of the self-hate. I am free of the disturbances that have been caused by other people's traumas. I am free and I am liberated. And that liberation is what we work through JAMP. And the reason I bring up JAMP is because it's actually the ultimate drive towards self. The quieter the wars in your head become, the more peaceful you are, the more expansive your view of the world becomes. It's no longer contained within a cell. You know, I always love to talk about Nelson Mandela. Such a beautiful individuation. We want to talk about the self. He spent almost 30 years in jail with people who hated him, ended up respecting him, knocking on the door, didn't know what to say to him. Where does that come from? He was a prisoner because he realized he was self. It was much greater than the organic body he was given. And that feeling, Gandhi had it also. That feeling of I am. That feeling is liberating. You're liberated. You're liberated from the internal contradictions of your existence. You know why you exist. You know the universe needs to be conscious of itself. So it's going to keep singing the song. It's going to keep painting the picture. It's going to keep creating the symphony. That's what it does. And that's the ultimate reflection of the self. We call it God. God, that was beautiful. God, I love that. God Almighty, did you see that? We call it God in many different languages. In Arabic, Allah. God. In different languages, we use the same term. It is greater than that which we understand. That energy, once we are no longer at war, what does Ben Kenobi say to Darth Vader? When you strike me down, I'll become more powerful than you could ever imagine. You basically, you free me from the last vestige of my connection to this organic frame. You let me loose. It is in those moments, it's like, so Neo, also, when you look at the Matrix, you look at the hero's journey, but ultimately the hero realizes the self. They overcome the ego and they realize the self. Otherwise, the hero remains a perpetual child, trying to emulate the same thing over and over again. Lance Armstrong does not transcend. Because all you want is the same feeling over and over again. You can't have it. Because once you've had it, it can't be recreated. You've already had it. You've already been conscious of it. Everything after it, it's like it, but it's no longer that feeling. It's the first time you say, wow, that is the self. The self is the one that says, wow. Because basically it's asking you, do you see me? Because every time we say, wow, what we are saying is, I see self. I see how this cosmos, this amazing universe works. I see self. I see the pattern. Do you know in every field, every single field, the number one thing is pattern recognition? Why? Archetypal structures.
Mm-hmm.
We always chase in the same way because we're all going in those circles.
I find it interesting that my first exposure to this kind of thinking and understanding was when I was quite young, and I looked up to college students. And at that point in time, this was in the late 60s, and most of the college students that talked like this and thought about this and wanted to achieve this state of being were, and I'm talking about students of physics, students of chemistry, all kinds of scientific minds, but they predominantly used psychoactive drugs to attain it. And they kind of walled themselves off from the corporate world of our economy. And I always found it interesting, I still find it interesting, that many of those same individuals 20 years later have short hair and are working as executives in corporations.
Well, I think in a way, two things happen. One is that you start to search for something when you're not aware of it. when you start searching for something when you're so young, you're not aware of what you're searching for. You haven't done the road. You haven't walked up the mountains. You haven't come down the bridges. You have to do that so you can move to the next step.
Right.
If you skip the step, the pattern will repeat itself.
Yeah.
The pattern will come back to say to you, hey, by the way, how are you going to feed yourself? The pattern comes back. Part of the experience and understanding of being human is to go through the pattern.
Well, and many of these individuals, you're right, they hadn't made that long journey yet. And for them, at least, the only way they could attain hanging around that state, they had to use external sources, outside ingredients to make that happen, rather than.
But that's not as important. The way you come by your experience, whether it's through meditation or yoga or a deep cleanse or mushrooms or whatever it is, whatever you're using to come to that state, the state needs to be integrated.
Yes.
You could have the state.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about myself, but other people are like smoke weed and get high, but you still have to integrate the state.
Yeah.
If you don't integrate the state, then it means nothing. Then you just got high.
Right. And that's what I was trying to say.
Laughed. I forgot. Oh, okay. Yeah. Great. But that does not, the idea of the individuation process is to integrate consciousness to the point where the self is able to pull in all the rest of the pieces because of the movement of energy towards wholeness. And I think of it like a small snowball that's rolling down a very, very tall mountain. Very slowly, that snowball is going to build momentum and become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's how you start to see wholeness. Yeah. Wholeness is exactly that snowball going down the mountain, becoming this huge, because the self is a concept. It's a self-created concept. Let's be honest. It's a self-created concept, but as any concept, does it hold? And it does. It holds because we have seen it throughout history, throughout alchemy, throughout science. We have seen these images of gods, of these greater beings, of these magnificent things that they could do and these powers they have, of Superman, of Wonder Woman, of Batwoman, of all these different characters who have all these abilities, this power, this drive. That is the symbol of the self. The self is the ultimate architect of archetypes. And when we forgot every single person, because we got sick of religion, we got sick of this, we got sick of that, what did the self do? It dug up every comic book and threw out every single hero it could at us. And said, okay, so you guys stop believing in the gods above. Okay, what about gods like you? And you're like me? Oh, I could become this? Great, yeah, I like that idea. Okay, I believe in that. I want to be the Flash. That is a reflection of the self. The interest in writing the story. Where does the story come from? The story comes from the greater self. What do we call it? Inspiration. No, it's self. It is capital S. It is the great self.
I'm glad you brought up the point of integration, because that was what I was missing in my story, because a number of those people that I knew did use those external experiences to battle their demons and work on their complexes and deal with their defenses. And they continued on in that journey. I know some of them today. And then many of them didn't. They didn't want to go through all those battles. And if they couldn't get it with taking a substance, then it just wasn't worth fighting. So it is all about, are you willing to integrate it? Are you going to work on integrating it?
Yes, but integration requires factors. This is like alchemy. This is why Jung was so interested in alchemy. Why can a 25-year-old integrate these things and become more integrated than a 50-year-old? But that is more the odd figure in the group. It's not the rule. The rule is that as you age, you're able to integrate more. But that also comes, integration also comes with economic liberation. It's easy to liberate yourself when you can feed yourself and you don't have to worry about food or rent, or it's easier to integrate those.
Yeah, easier. Yeah.
Of course. I mean, you still have to take care of the organic self. You can't be in your head all day. You can't be on psychoactives and try to function. You have to be able to feed yourself and connect to the outside world so it feeds you.
Yeah, what I was trying to get to, just wasn't able to for some reason, but just wasn't thinking about it. But yes, it does take time. Yes, it does take a journey. Yes, it does take all the things that you just mentioned. In addition to that, and this is what failed me for about a decade in my life, is that I have to have an intentionality toward it. I have to make some choices to go in that direction toward integration. It doesn't just all happen by itself. You have to make choices.
No, it doesn't happen by itself. You're correct. But there's a self-conscious guide. And that self-conscious guide is the one that makes choices. Mm-hmm. The stronger the ego development is, the more integrated the ego is, the more you're able to strengthen it at the same time let go. You cannot strengthen something that's always falling apart. Like we used to work with kids who were wards of the state who grew up in horrendous circumstances. They could not maintain their ego structure long enough to integrate certain events, certain feeling states. And that creates chaos and havoc. So here, just to get back to Stein, I wanted to talk about, he says, there are other self-images that we use for the self, like gemstones, like diamonds and sapphires, stones. They represent high, rare value, yet further self-representation includes castles, churches, vessels, containers, mosques, wheels, centers, spokes, radiating outward, ending in circular rims, very tall skyscrapers. I'm adding a couple of things. There's also human figures like kings, queens, uncles, aunts, parents, princesses. There are also animal images that symbolize the self. The elephant, the horse, the bull, the bear, the fish, and the snake. Now, what did he just say? Why did he say from everything from minerals to rocks to buildings to... Because that's the cosmos reflecting itself back.
Yes.
That's what the self is. And that's why its representation takes on so many different forms. That's why it's a shapeshifter.
And people are drawn to those forms.
Because it's the original form the cosmos has perfected. Look at that giraffe. How did this evolve? No, that's the cosmos. That's how it lives. That's how it grows. Every time a rock dies and breaks up and gets dragged its rocks across universal space and then gets pulled by gravitational field of a planet, then falls onto that planet and something happens. Something changes. Something grows. Something evolves. Because it is a universal symbol.
Yeah.
It's when we look at the stars, when we look at the star constellations and we go, wow, what is that? That's a road. What does that look like? Oh, it looks like a horse. Oh, it looks like this. Those are symbols of the self.
I'm glad that he included, I was thinking this when I read it, he included a star in that section that you read.
Oh, for sure.
And I was thinking about it. I watched Sports Center today, and I was thinking about the Dallas Cowboys, America's team, the guys with the star on their helmet, and people who want to go. I've heard NFL football players, yeah, I want to go there. I want that star on my helmet.
Yeah,
and they haven't won a Super Bowl in 25 years, and yet they're still America's team. Everybody wants that star on their helmet.
Yeah.
And
it's archetypal symbols.
So powerful.
It's archetypal symbols. I mean, why did the archetypal symbol of a bear, of a cougar, these are archetypal symbols of an eagle, of a falcon, of a panther. These are archetypal symbols. These are symbols of the self.
Yeah.
These are symbols of our heroes, our superheroes. Powers like a panther, or moves like a cheetah, or, can move things like an elephant,
Whole cultures eat their inner organs in order to obtain some of that power.
Okay. Yeah, of course, because it is symbolic of the alchemical process. It is symbolic of the way we integrate things. We have been on this planet for so long that we forget how we got here. We killed everything in sight. Now we're talking about not killing each other, but we killed everything in sight. We dominated this planet, and this is why there's so much less diversity on this planet. In terms of plant life, in terms of trees, in terms of flora, in terms of just natural habitats. We have destroyed them. So we are a very predatory type of being, but there's always this other function to us where we give our life up for somebody, where we save somebody, where we go out of the way to help somebody. There is this numinous quality about us. Where does that come from? That's the self. The self is saying, become more conscious. The self is saying, you need to become a lot more conscious. The planet is dying. You have treated it like a garbage can. You can't do that anymore. Because the water is going to be too hot to have anything in it, and you're not going to be able to drink it. And that's going to create hurricanes and typhoons that are going to destroy cities. You need to take care. You need to become conscious. We are being forced to become conscious of the world.
There are already populated islands that are now underwater, and people have had to move or are moving off of them.
Exactly. Because we have done this in a very short period of time throughout history. But now, more than ever, the self is being called upon. And the self requires that we all heal. And that's why I brought up Gem today, because it's not just self-promotion. That's part of it, but to be honest. But it's also what we are working towards, which is healing. The more we heal, the more we're more sensitive to healing around us, to making space for those around us to heal. The more we're in pain, the more those around us cause us more pain, we cause them more pain, and that vicious cycle keeps turning and turning. So, I wanted to talk about the self as the central mystery of the psyche. So what is this thing? What is this thing called the self? What do we think about this thing? I'd like to think about it as creation. Creation is referred to in different histories and different mythologies as a god or a goddess. Most of the time, a goddess. Creation. But creation itself is that which is it is, which is the self. We say it when we have a child. We say we've created a new life. We have given, we have imparted a self. That's not us, that's creation. We haven't done it. We're just tools of creation. Creation set us up to do that. It says the self as the central mystery of the psyche. Stein says, it's obvious from Jung's writing that unity and totality were his highest values and that the self formed his personal myth. But it is a myth that he attempted to ground in evidence theory, more correctly, the theory of the self. The concept that there is a transcendent center that governs the psyche from outside of itself, circumscribed its entirety, was a means that Jung used to account for basic psychological phenomena, such as the spontaneousness appearance of circles or mandalas, the self-regulating function of the psyche, and what he called compensation, the progressive development of consciousness through lifespan, and what he called individuation, the existence of numerous polarities evident in psychological life that form coherent structures and generate energy. Jung has been criticized by some conservative theologians for transforming the self into a God concept and worshiping at the shrine which he himself created. He would likely counter such an accusation by arguing that as an empirical scientist, he was simply observing the fact, trying to account for their existence, for their relation to one another. To him, the concept of the self offered the best explanation he could provide for one of the central mysteries of the psyche, creation. The central mystery of the psyche is creation. How, what, where, when? Creation. How did you come up with it? People ask. How did you come up with Gem? Creation. They want to know the creation story. To him, the concept of the self offered the best explanation it could provide for one central mystery of the psyche, its seemingly miraculous creativity, its centering dynamics, and its deep structures of order and coherence. There is an order. Even within chaos, there is an order. That's the rule of the universe. There is order. And what looks completely disordered is just a pattern you haven't recognized. All AI machines are built on pattern recognition right now. Why? First step of consciousness. They're treating AI like it's the new bread and butter and candy of the 21st century. It's a very, very deadly candy. You have to become conscious of AI very quickly because it's going to be conscious of you. Whoever's playing with AI right now, and I know some of the smartest minds in the world right now are working on AI. Whoever is doing it right now, just remember, creation is not of your control. Once you create it, genie does not go back into bottle. Pandora's box, you cannot close. There's a reason there's warnings throughout history. Warnings throughout history. Pandora's box. Pandora's box. That's what they did in the Los Alamos labs. They opened Pandora's box and then they scared the shit out of themselves. It's like, oh shit, we could burn this planet to ash. What have we done? Pandora's box. So now AI. And everybody is rushing towards that door. AI, the future is here, the future. Well, it's coming. Because you have opened Pandora's box and it's going to come out.
Makes me think of the company Cyberdyne in the Terminator series.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, Eric, nothing comes from nothing, by the way.
Yeah.
We create our unconscious fears. We psychologically will create our worst fears in the external world. Because creation doesn't have right and wrong. Creation is pure. It is born innocent. Because creation is self. It is a direct reflection of the cosmos. Beyond creation, there's a whole slew of shit that could happen. That's why be conscious of what you create. If you are creating something that's going to replace you, bet every penny you have, it's going to replace you. That's what they forget.
There was a great Star Trek episode where a scientist created a brain for the computer of the Enterprise, and it took over the ship. And there's nothing they could do about it.
No, because it's archetypal.
And of course, Captain Kirk in the end talked it down, you know.
Well, of course, because he's archetypal too.
He made it kill itself.
Well, he was more like a Superman character.
Yeah.
Than a captain of a ship.
But that didn't cause the point of the show to be lost at all.
No, because everything that we imagine is possible, Eric. It's possible.
Yeah.
Everything that we imagine doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from where? It comes from our connection to the rest of the cosmos. That's where it comes from. That's why we can imagine creatures like Godzilla, because they once roamed this planet. They were called dinosaurs. We can imagine these things because they have already existed. The patterns are already there. You cannot make something out of nothing. First law of thermodynamics. It's a beautiful law. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The cosmos has given you a rule. Oh, that's interesting. It can't be created nor destroyed. Where is this coming from? That's your energy. You know those people who play worst game scenarios? They're creating worst game scenarios. The person who goes on TV and reports on the worst case scenario of the situation is basically planting a creative story into what will be the worst case scenario one day. It'll play itself out. And somebody said, I told you. That's self. It's beautiful. It's elusive. It changes forms. It gives you a glimpse to the outside and it shows you the inside. And then it says, okay, what do you think? And then you're like, fuck, what do you mean, what do I think? What is that question? And leaves you twirling for a couple of days.
Yeah, because more often than not, it happens without us even realizing it, that it's happening.
Correct.
We think we're controlling it to accomplish something else.
We think that we are in control.
Yeah.
And that is the biggest mistake that we can make. The biggest mistake that we can make is that we can think we're in control. That's how we create AI that's going to create havoc. And believe you and me, AI is going to create havoc. And there will be calls from different governments and different groups around the world to manage AI, to assess AI, to assess its volatility, to assess, do we want to bring in consciousness? We're way past that. We've opened Pandora's box. What's interesting is throughout time, we have opened Pandora's box. It's never worked out well. It has never worked out well. Every time we do it, we end up regretting it and talking about it for years in political science classes. How could we have avoided that situation? Don't open the box.
We don't learn.
Because that is creation. That is the cosmos. The only way we learn is by fucking shit up. With that, I am Dr. Lahab El Samurai, and this is the IFC's Individuation Podcast. We kind of got on different roads today in terms of going back to the self. What Jung talked about as the architect of order.
It's a great chapter.
It is an excellent book for those we recommend it. Those who want to learn about Dr. Murray Stein and Carl Jung, some very eloquent, beautiful writing, very rich writing and understandable, comprehensive, and appreciated. So next week is the emergence of the self. individuation. We already started talking about individuation. Next week, we will expand the idea of what is individuation. We love this series. And so we put out a poll about what you would like to listen to in the podcast. And we got a lot of feedback on fairy tales. So we're going to do Dr. Mary Louise von Franz, The Shadow in Fairy Tales. She has a book. So we're going to do that after Dr. Stein's book. We're going to go chapter by chapter and talk about fairy tales and their archetypal structures and how the shadow fits in. Because what Dr. Stein says is a very interesting point in this chapter. We didn't quite go through it, but he says that the shadow is connected to the psychoid realm, which leaves a very, very interesting opening into how why it's so connected to so much pain. But we will get into that more as we go through Dr. von Franz's book, The Shadow in Fairy Tales. But for today, I would like to thank you very much. We will be back next week with chapter 8 on the individuation process. I'm Dr. Lahab Al-Samurai. This is Dr. Eric Tomlinson. Eric, you want to say goodbye to our listeners?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for allowing me to talk about this and explore these incredible ways of thinking.
Well, we really appreciate you being here with us. Otherwise, it's just me talking to everybody. And usually after a while, I just get tired of listening to my own voice. So it's nice to have somebody to listen to and to have an audience. So thank you, Eric. And with that, this is the IFC's Individuation Podcast. Until next week.